All right, today, October 20th, 2021, we're going to do part 4 of the residential purchase agreement. And this would be the old version, as we're expecting a new RPA that I'm being told is 16 pages coming up here in December, which is just a few months away. And Larry mentioned that somebody is going to share that with him, and hopefully we'll be able to share that with us coming up here pretty quick. So thank you guys for logging in early. My name is Alex, and I'm not an attorney or an accountant, so I'm not necessarily giving any legal advice, but I certainly have been in the business 32 years and have seen the RPA go from 2 pages along with some disclosures that have come and gone that go along with the purchase agreement, but also have seen it grow to 10 pages and then close to 6 or 7 additional pages. California privacy, the fair housing, wire fraud, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Those are all additional addenda to the purchase agreement. So I'm curious to see if that stuff is going to be incorporated in the new purchase agreement, which is now 16 pages. I'm assuming it is, mainly because I don't know how they could add so much more to the purchase agreement. But we'll have to wait and see. I did want to hold these classes and put them on record so we can reference them and go back and see what was going on, what's going on now with the purchase agreement versus the new one, which I'm hoping to have the new presentation up early next year, and hopefully it'll be around 6 parts, right? Because this one took 6 parts to put together. I was actually hoping to make it a smaller series, but I just couldn't do it. There was too much to talk about. So that said, there is 21 slides. Like I said, I did want to kind of get an early start on this one. So thank you guys for logging in early. Let's move forward. So today is part 4 of 6. We have covered 3 parts so far. There's my information. You guys are muted. I appreciate that. I will mute you on my side, but if you guys care to chime in at any time, feel free, or you can use the chat room if you like. But if and when you're done with your comments and or questions, please mute yourself on your side, just trying to avoid the background noise, okay? And you can also use the chat room. I'll try to get to the chat after every slide and answer any questions or anything like that. Thank you guys for logging in early again. And as always, feel free to invite anybody that you think might be benefit from these classes, as well as get good information, okay? And it's licensed or unlicensed, any age. This is kid friendly and also licensed or unlicensed friendly. We don't require vaccination cards here either, okay? So thank you guys for logging on. So let's get started. Any questions or comments thus far? Okay, in part 1, we went over what we must first understand, what it is we do as licensed agents, right? This presentation has been separated into 6 parts, designed for separate day training. This is part 4 of 6. So part 1 included the agency disclosure, the PRBS, the WFA, the BIA, the TA, which is the trust advisory, the real estate owner advisory, and the short sale addendum, as well as California consumer privacy. And there was a new one that came out after I had put this presentation together, which is the fair housing advisory, which we will talk about in coming months. You guys are welcome to print it out and read it. Any questions about the first part or part 1? So that's a quick overview on part 1. In part 2, we covered what an offer is and the tools we use to give your client proper representation. We cover the many different types of purchase agreements. We will focus on the one that is mainly used by most agents in the industry, the RPA, which is the acronym for the 10-page purchase agreement. but purchase agreements can be more specific. It is important to know that they at least exist, right? And that's including the letter of intent, which is really any purchase agreement. It could be, it could literally be in a text message if you so attempt to put in an offer like that. The CPA, the condominium conversion, the new construction purchase agreement. There's the notice of default purchase agreement, probate purchase agreement, the income property purchase agreement, and then of course the RPA. So that was primarily part two of the 6-part series, and that also covered pages 1 and 2, right? And I believe that was up to section 8 or section 7. I'm sorry, of the purchase agreement, which is the first few pages. Okay, any questions or comments on that? And then part 3, which was last week, we went over section 8, 9, and 10, which starts on page 3. These sections discuss what is being proposed specifically, what happens at closing, whom is to receive possession, the process of disclosure, and the buyer and seller's ability to cancel. Right, and those sections, items include in and exclude from sale, stoves, refrigerators, personal property, that kind of thing. Leased or liened items, closing and possession, seller to remain in possession, tenant occupied properties, statutory and other disclosures and cancellation rights, natural and environmental hazards disclosure and booklets, withholding or FERPTA, Megan's Law database, notice regarding gas and hazardous liquid pipelines, and condominium and planned developments. Those were sections 8 through 10 of the RP, and that was part 3, which we did last week. And as mentioned before, I'm recording these, so we'll be able to, I put them up in the channel, we'll be able to review them at our leisure whenever you want. And this definitely is the old RPA because we do have one coming up in December. Right? Any questions or comments on that? So in part 4, we would begin at the top of page 5 of the RPA, section 11, and continue with sections 12, 13, 14 from page 6. So as you can see, I mean, there's actually 2 more parts to this entire series. So we just have barely put a dent in the RPA. These sections talk about the condition of the property, the as-is clause, the buyer's investigation rights, title and vesting, contingency periods, and buyer and seller's right of cancellation. So these sections include condition of the property, buyer's investigation of property and matters affecting it, buyer's indemnity and seller protection to enter the property, title and vesting, time periods, removal of contingencies and cancellation rights, seller's right to cancel, notice of buyer or seller to perform, effect of buyer's removal of contingencies, close of escrow, effect of cancellation on deposits, which is important. So any questions or comments on that overview? Now, again, that's what we'll be going over today. So actually, I just realized that was animated incorrectly, but that's okay. So let's start with section 11. Okay, the condition of the property. And this section actually is probably one of the most misunderstood sections, mainly because we use the word as is very freely. Okay, people like to say the word as is as if it means that the seller's not going to do anything. You're just buying it as is. Okay. We have to read the part where it says in its present physical condition, right? And it doesn't mean that the buyer has to purchase it if something is revealed that they're not satisfied with. Because remember, there is a price tag attached to this purchase. And so let's not get confused with the part where it says as is. So if you're making an offer on a property and it's accepted, the seller saying, okay, well, they're just buying it as is. No, they are actually, they have inspection rights on the property. They also can appraise the property and they have to get a loan on the property. So meaning that they can cancel. So are they really buying the property as is? Not necessarily, okay? This is where it gets a little confusing for most. And this is why this section is very important in terms of what it means. And it talks about it here. It's subject to buyer's investigation rights, right? All debris and personal property, not including the sale, shall be removed. This is the slang word that we use in real estate is called broom swept, right? But understand that the property can have all kinds of debris and all kinds of stuff. So when the seller sees the word as is, does that mean that the buyer's really buying it as is? No, the seller has to remove all the debris, just like it says there, unless of course they agree to something else in writing, right? So this is where it gets a little confusing, right? Seller shall within the time specified disclose known material facts and defects. So are the buyers really buying the property as is, or does the seller need to tell them that all the things that are there on the property? And it says it in bold type: disclose known material facts and defects, right? And it continues to say affecting the property included known insurance claims within the past 5 years and make any and all other disclosures required by law, which is also part 10 of the RPA, which we talked about last week, or section 10. So the buyer has the right to conduct investigations on the property specified in 14B, which we haven't covered yet, based upon information discovered in those investigations. They can cancel the agreement or request the seller make repairs. So again, are they really getting it as is? Not necessarily, right? So let's not confuse the word as is, because I see agents constantly putting that in their counter offers. And if you use those words, okay, know what you're trying to say in a counter offer. If you're trying to say that the seller's not going to do any repairs, just say that. Don't say buyers purchasing the property as is, because you would simply just be repeating what it says here, and that's not what it means. If you're trying to get the point across on your counteroffer that the seller's not going to do any repairs, just say that. Seller will not do any repairs. Don't use the as is clause terminology. That's just a recommendation and a little nugget for today, okay? But understand that because most of the time the buyer, and sorry, I'm just letting some people in here, the buyer is doing their investigations, and they have contingencies most of the time that they can cancel, and that's section B, and it's highlighted there, can cancel this agreement, right? Or request repairs, right? So now understanding that on the request for repairs, there's actually, I think it's the very first sentence on the request for repairs in bold type. It actually says the seller does not have to respond. Okay, so buyers strongly advised to conduct investigations of the entire property in order to determine its present condition. Seller may not be aware of all defects affecting the property or other facts that buyer considers important. Property improvements may not be built according to code in compliance with current law or have had permits issued. So which means that there really isn't any warranties or guarantees on the property either. And a lot of times you'll see me put that on my private remarks on MLS, that the seller gives no warranties or guarantees. I would recommend putting those comments, but understand that it's also the attorneys at CAR have also built this in to the contract. So there are a few misconceptions about the as is clause, okay? That the seller is saying that he or she does not at point of acceptance need to consider any repairs or credits to buyer if requested, right? So that's a misconception. So sellers need to understand that what the word as is doesn't necessarily mean that. It means the buyer can still cancel, the buyer can still do their investigations, the buyer can still request repairs. The buyer can request a price reduction. So are they really buying it as is? No, they're not. Understand that the wording as is a clause that has a definition, and you can read that definition. If you can Google it, just put as is clause, and that's what will come up. Okay. That the buyer must accept the property in its present condition and cannot cancel because of it, and that's a misconception. Yes, they can cancel because of it, right? So again, these are misconceptions. Okay. Any questions or comments on that part, on section 11? I can talk about section 11 for days, mainly because I've got all kinds of stories about it. Arguments, people saying that, oh no, you can't do that and stuff like that. But it's pretty clear here what it says. Okay, there are exceptions. The buyers can cancel. There isn't the as such a thing as the as is clause. Okay, so understand that these are things, if you're taking a listing, that we need to explain to our client, the seller. Now, if you guys read the seller's advisory, most of that stuff is there. And there is some things that talk about the as is clause also in the listing agreement. Okay, which we will cover in other classes, but I did want to mention that this all kind of ties together. But the important thing is, and again, I'll give this to you guys as a little nugget. Don't use that terminology. Don't say buyer is buying the property as is, because when you say that, you're using a clause that doesn't apply to what you really mean. Most of what you really mean, and I say this because I see it all the time, is if you're going to put that on a counteroffer, make sure that you say that seller is not going to do any repairs. Just say it. Don't say as is, because if you say as is, guess what? This is what you're talking about. Okay. So let's do a funny real quick. Attention to detail is very important. For example, here the agent has dragged the body outside before taking the photograph. I thought that was kind of funny. So anyway, I don't know if you guys are laughing or not. You're on mute, so I'll take it that you are. Okay. So let's move on to section 12. Okay. So buyer's investigation of the property and matters affecting property. So this is to me is very interesting. Okay, and this is actually what I just highlighted there. Okay, buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any matter affecting the property is a contingency. What? It's a contingency. So matters affecting the property, and that's anything affecting the property. So we're not just talking about investigation, appraisal, and loan contingencies. And it's mainly because those are the normal contingencies that actually contractually that we see on section 3 on page 2. We see the appraisal and loan contingency, and then on section 14 we see the investigation contingency, right? But here it's talking about any matters affecting the property. And you'll see on the contingency removal, and this kind of sheds a little bit of light on what this is talking about. The contingency removal actually has a bunch of different check marks where you can remove different contingencies like title, HOA. I don't remember off the top of my head, but if you look at the contingency removal form, it actually has a bunch of different check marks and ability to remove these different contingencies. But if there is something affecting the property, the buyer can cancel or attempt to renegotiate for those reasons. And this is what it talks about here. Okay. So the buyer shall have the right at buyer's expense, unless otherwise agreed, to conduct investigations, inspections, test surveys, and other studies, right? Shall not include roof coverings. This I thought was a little strange when I read this, but here you have it. It says it shall not include water tests or shower pans on upper level units unless the owners of property below the shower consent. Shall not include roof coverings, and if the property is a unit in a condominium, other common interest subdivision shall not include common areas. So buyer's investigation, even though a buyer can go look at the common areas if they want to, say they're in a condominium or a PUD, right? Or they're in like a planned unit development, okay? They could potentially go investigate, but that's not a reason to cancel their transaction. They can't necessarily say, oh, you know what? I don't like that for whatever reason. They can't necessarily use that as a reason. But when I saw shall not include roof coverings, I'm like, wow, why not? Well, the inspectors go out and they tell us about the roof coverings. So I don't know. I thought that was a little strange. Do you guys have any comments on that? Because when I saw that, I was a little taken back. So buyer's investigations are made an automatic contingency unless the buyer and seller both agree to waive them in writing otherwise. So understand that if there is a checkbox under section 14 that actually gives the buyer the ability to remove all of their investigation rights, where it says is that buyer waives all their contingencies, meaning loan appraisal and inspection or investigation. And that's where it would be in writing otherwise. Or you could potentially put that in a counteroffer, but understand that any matters affecting the property are a contingency. So that is automatic, okay? So now section A2, and I thought this was interesting as well. Inspect for lead base, right? Confirm the insurability of the buyer on the property, including the availability of cost of flood and fire insurance. Review and seek approval of leases, which is important. Buyer shall neither make nor cause to be made invasive or destructive buyer investigations. And oddly enough, some of you who logged on early today, we had a show on Real Estate Rant. We had a real estate inspector, and we were talking about that word, invasive, right? An inspector can't go around breaking things or getting inside of walls and or inside of floors or attics where he has to break things to get into them. It's non-invasive, right? To do their investigations, because I have had clients complain about, oh, you know, Alex, we were remodeling the bathroom, and when we took the wall off, man, the wall behind it was all corroded, right? Well, there was no way for the inspector to know that. So these are things that are not known, so they're really not covered by anything necessarily. There's an assumption that, you know, those kind of things usually reveal themselves on the exterior or on the surface of where they're corroded. In this case, that wasn't the case, okay? But their investigations are certainly non-invasive. So please note that lead-based paint disclosure requests that a buyer decided to perform a risk assessment from a licensed contractor. And that's on page 2 of the FLD, or the lead-based paint disclosure. Take a look at on the signature side, on the signature page, right above where the buyer signs, there's a little checkbox. And I didn't put a visual up of it because it's pretty easily explained, that the buyer can do a risk assessment for the lead-based paint. So don't forget to check that box as to whether or not they will perform one, okay? Because if it's unchecked, it means they didn't waive it, meaning that they should have that investigation available for the agents involved and to the clients involved, both buyer and seller. Remember section 12B of the which we're coming up to. You'll see that the buyer actually has to give that information to the seller at no cost. So any questions or comments on that on section 12 A and number 1 and 2? So let's move on to section 12B, which is actually the section I was just talking about. Seller should make the property available for all buyers' investigations as specified in 14B, complete buyer's investigations and either remove contingencies or cancel the agreement. So we'll go back to the as-is clause again. They either are going to move forward with the transaction or they're required to cancel, right? So give seller at no cost complete copies of all such investigation reports obtained by buyer which obligation shall survive the termination of this agreement, meaning that if the buyer decides to cancel, they still have to cough up any investigations that were done on the property. And I'll tell you how many times I've had conversations, right? And it goes, actually, I forgot that I put this up here, but does appraisal fall under the category of buyer's investigations? Okay. What do you guys think on that? Okay. Let's see if somebody can answer me on this. And I know we've had discussion about it.
Yes.
Larry, absolutely. Thank you. Yes, the appraisal does fall under investigation. And so this is the conversation that I've had with agents. They say, well, no, an appraisal is not an investigation, it's an estimated value. And so, okay, so they didn't investigate the property, they didn't measure it, they didn't take pictures, they didn't check for fenestration or functional layout design, they didn't check for condition, they didn't do any of those things. I'm sorry, but they did. And so many times have I sat there and had these conversations with agents, and I've even had to point out to them so the first part of this series, in part one, we talked about the agency relationship, and on that section C, on the AD form, the agency relationship form, it talks about that the agent is required to disclose anything affecting value or desirability. So when we're talking about value, are we talking about the appraisal? Absolutely, they have to disclose it. So not only does the seller and the buyer, not only are they agreeing to this here in writing now because they're signing this contract, but the agent is also obligated to cough it up. So this, I mentioned the appraisal because I've had so many agents tell me, oh, that doesn't include the appraisal. And I said, well, can you tell me where on that paragraph it says accept the appraisal? Because I don't see it there. So, and how funny, okay, because we all know why agents want to hide appraisals, but how funny is it if it's the reverse? So if the appraisal came in super high, oh, they don't want anybody to know about it. But if it came in low, all of a sudden that confidential piece of information all of a sudden becomes public. Oh no, Mr. Seller, we would like a price reduction. Here's a copy of the appraisal. Oh, that cracks me up. And it really chaps my hide, let me tell you. So seller shall have water, gas, electricity, and all operable pilots on. For the inspection, it is wise to remind the listing agent of section C when the offer is accepted and begin your client's investigation quickly. And the only reason I say that is because, man, you run out of time really fast. And for some reason, sellers like to squeeze the time down that they've kind of put down to maybe about 3 weeks, but they try to squeeze it down to 10 days. And it's not impossible to do investigations in 10 days, but it is certainly difficult. So this is why I always say, if you get something under contract, make sure you start investigations as soon as possible, okay? So now we're getting into some tricky stuff here, which I won't spend a lot of time on. We're actually on slide number 10, which we're actually doing pretty good on time. We're at 6:29 right now. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I will try and explain it to the best of my ability, okay? So buyer and indemnity and seller protection for entry upon property. So pretty much buyer shall require anyone acting on buyer's behalf to carry policies and liability. And we talked about that in the show that we were watching previously on Real Estate Rant, that the inspector carries $1 million of E&O insurance. Now, should we try and verify that before we hire an inspector to go out? Absolutely. They have an indemnity policy that if they happen to fall off the roof or something, they're covered. It doesn't necessarily fall on the liability of the seller, okay? So I'll just kind of skim through this real quick. Buyer shall keep the property free and clear of liens, repair all damage arising from buyer's investigation, which I'll go back to number one. If the seller's selling the property, they shouldn't be taking out loans or doing anything to take out liens on the property. And this is a stipulation here. So they're pretty much telling the seller, Mr. Seller, now you cannot take out a loan on this property or put a lien against it because now you're under contract, okay? Indemnify and hold seller harmless from all resulting liability claims, demands, damages, and costs. And so I'll just kind of fast forward here. Notice of non-responsibility. So seller is advised that certain protections may be afforded seller by recording an NNR for buyer investigation and work done on the property at buyer's direction. Buyer's obligations under this paragraph shall survive the termination of this agreement. Okay, so we have a question. Why buyer agent is not allowed to talk to appraiser? So it's kind of off topic, okay, but I'll just kind of briefly mention this. I was an appraiser for 20 years, 13 years out in the field, and I was a review appraiser for 7 years at Argent Mortgage. I did all 50 states, okay? So you just have to wrap your head around this real quick. When I was out in the field, I got bribed many times. Do you think that's wrong or right? And when I say I was bribed, they attempted to bribe me because I never took a bribe, okay? But that should answer your question as to why buyer's agents actually, this is what the law says, okay? The law says that anybody related to the transaction cannot influence the appraiser considering value. So your question is worded, why are they not allowed to talk to the appraiser? You can talk to an appraiser. You just can't talk about value. So if an appraiser tells you, I can't talk to you, that appraiser's full of it. Yeah, they can talk to you because there are things that appraisers need to know from the agents, like the contract. They need a copy of the contract. If there's anything like say the agent wants to give the appraiser a permit, or they want to give the appraiser an addendum that relates to the transaction, they want to give the appraiser some information that's pertinent to their job, but they can't talk to the appraiser or influence the appraiser consisting of value. So that's what the law says. So if anybody tells you any different, they don't know what the law is. And it's typical for them to make that blanket statement. So I hope that answers your question, okay? But kind of going back to the buyer indemnity, okay? This is simply something in the contract that's protecting the seller, because now they're allowing people to come onto the property and it doesn't belong to them yet. And it's kind of like an insurance policy. They are protected. This part of the contract is protecting the seller and warning the buyer, hey, Mr. Buyer, you have to be careful when you're bringing people onto the property, and you have to be careful not to break anything or that kind of thing. But in that event, know that they're required to carry liability policies, right? So, okay, Mr. Doshi, you got another question. So if I'm a buyer's agent and if I have inspection which has mold, can you tell the appraiser? I'll be honest with you, because I was an appraiser. Appraisers don't rate mold. It's not a value consideration. So when you say, can you tell the appraiser, what's the importance of that? The only person that should really know that is the buyer, because now what you need is mold remediation. And the buyer should know whether or not what consideration in terms of cost is that going to affect their purchase. Does that make sense? It doesn't affect the appraiser whatsoever because it's not a value consideration. Now, if it's excessive mold, the appraiser will probably see it and it would be considered a health and safety issue at that point. But when you're talking about the kind of mold that we usually see, the kind where you spray some Tilex on it and it goes away, that's not something the appraiser is going to call out because it's not something that is affecting the value of the property. Because remember, what appraisers are doing, yes, they are looking for health and safety issues, but for the most part, they're estimating value, right? So I hope that answers your question. Because what it sounds to me like, you want to give the appraiser this information for a reason. And ultimately, what I said earlier, do you have the right to talk to the appraiser considering value. And I would say that that's what you're doing by pointing out mold. If he doesn't see it, then it doesn't concern him. Okay. The person who it does concern is now the buyer and seller, and you guys need to figure that out. It has nothing to do with the appraisal. Okay, so let's move on. So we talked about the NNR. This is a notice of non-responsibility. Be sure to hire services that carry insurance when entering the subject property. It's something should be damaged, whether person or property, you're covered. Okay. So any questions or comments on that slide? So title investing within the time specified, buyer shall be provided a title report. So this is something that that isn't necessarily required unless, of course, you're getting a loan. Okay, but you can write this out of the contract. Is only an offer by the title insurer, right? So title prelim is simply an offer, because remember, title is an insurance. Okay. So the policy of title insurance and may not contain every item affecting title. So that means that title insurance policies can be fallible, or think of it like this: their title insurance policies are not infallible, meaning that they potentially can have mistakes, and there's that warning. Okay. The company providing the title report shall, prior to issuing the report, conduct a search of the general index for all sellers except banks or other institutional lenders selling properties they require through foreclosure, right? Sellers shall within 7 days give escrow holder a complete statement of information, which is it's a single page, usually single page, sometimes 2 pages of the seller's information, and pretty much what it's doing, it's identifying the seller, very specific things that only the seller would know. So title is taken in its present condition, subject to all encumbrances, these conditions, restrictions, rights, and other matters, whether or record not as the date of acceptance, unless buyer is assuming those obligations, which again can be in writing. But the assumption is that no, you want the property free and clear, right? Or taking the subject property to those obligations, right? Preliminary title report is not title insurance until the transaction is closed and the company has issued a policy. Can title issues pop up during the transaction? Anybody? Can title issues pop up during the transaction?
Of course.
Yeah, of course they can, right? And they do pop up. And this is where now sometimes your title rep can get involved. Sometimes your loan agent can get involved. Sometimes your agents can get involved in terms of trying to find a solution to those. Sometimes there's reconveyances. Sometimes there is stuff that's taken off because it's either old or incorrect. Sometimes it doesn't belong to that person, and that information is revealed. But these are things that can pop up. So it's important for you as agents to review the title policy. Don't just assume that the escrow company is looking at it and is interested in your better interests, because that's not always the case. Okay, the escrow company simply is doing their job in trying to make sure that the property is free and clear, but there might be something on there that maybe they didn't catch. So it's important to work as a team along with your title professionals, along with escrow as an agent and your client, the buyer. Work as a team and read through it closely to make sure that you understand everything that's on it. And usually it's just 1 or 2 pages. You don't have to read all 18 pages of the title prelim, right? Although you should skim through it, but for the most part, the important pages or the meat of the prelim is 1 or 2 pages. So it's not a lot of reading, But it's important, really. You should always look through that stuff. The buyer is accepting the title in its present condition for items that pass with a property transfer. It is important to go over some of those items with your client. Oh, that was a question, which actually I just talked about. Okay, those are the examples. So that's actually the next question, right? So any questions or comments on that section?
Yeah, Alex. I mean,
Yes,
I just
sir.
had somebody that just is selling their house here in the valley and going to Kentucky and buying a house there. And they're in a group that I'm in, so they ended up calling, asked, should I get title insurance? And I says, well, of course. I mean, how do you know what's going to be there when you get there without it? Because do you trust the seller in many cases? I mean, they could be very honest back east. It's not to say anything else, but you got to do business as business is done. Check it out, know what you're getting first off. So that's my caveat, is like, make sure you're getting what they're telling you you're getting. Not that you say, hey, you have an option to not get it and the cost. To me, it's well worth peace of mind.
Yeah, and Larry, what you're talking about is we've become comfortable with the way we do business here in California. And sometimes we don't understand, well, geez, I wonder if all the same checks and balances exist in other states. They do, and there's no reason why we should think that those checks and balances don't exist.
Yeah.
They may be a little different, and their laws may be a little different, but they're not all that different. Now, when we're going back east, sometimes we're dealing with attorneys versus escrow companies, because that's, I'm sorry, versus versus escrow companies, because that's how things are done over there. But it's pretty much the same thing, right? But you're right. We get into this comfort zone and wondering, oh, gee, I wonder, should I get that done too? Like, like we talked earlier about inspection, right? Yeah, of course you should get an inspection on your property. Of course you should get title insurance. Let's not take those things for granted, right? So yeah, good point, Larry. That's something that definitely, if we visualize it that way, it actually makes what we're talking about here in this contract a little more clear, right? As to why we're looking at it. It's a protection. It's a check and balance. It's a protection that we have, and that's why it's called insurance, right? That somebody has eyes on it, and they're visualizing that this property is free and clear when it closes, and they're ensuring you are being insured for that. And if for some odd reason there is an imperfection in the title, the insurance, theoretically is supposed to take care of it. And this is what actually they're pretty much betting on, is that they took care of it before the deal closed, right? The insurer is ensuring that they checked, and they're pretty much telling you, oh yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with this. It's clear.
Yeah, and part of that is like when they pay off, and you probably see it as a transaction coordinator, where a lender, you get paid off and they don't record the reconveyance. You see it all the time, pop up different places, and you just want to make sure that that's cleaned up as you go. And this is the best way of knowing that. And the policy states that.
Yeah, exactly. And as we mentioned before, can you purchase a property without title? I mean, yeah, if you're a cash buyer, you can do that. Is it smart to do without insurance? I would say it's probably one of the dumbest things you can do, especially because these purchases are not small. It's not like you're buying a watch. You know what I mean? You're buying a very large purchase, and some of the property nowadays is to the tune of $500,000. That's nothing to sneeze at. So title insurance, I'm speaking theoretically. I would require it, like on every transaction. Is it required? No. Lenders require it, but if you're a cash buyer, well, I mean, it's just one of those things. So let's move on to section 13, okay? Within the time specified, seller has a duty to disclose to buyer all matters known to the seller affecting title, whether of record or not. So it's just one single sentence, plain, free and clear. Seller has to say this stuff, right? At close of escrow, buyer shall receive a grant deed conveying title, so they're actually saying it, right? The manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences. Consult an appropriate professional. Now, understand that the reason why this is here is because anytime you sell something, so now that you've bought it, okay, there is now the opportunity and the availability for you to sell it. So they're telling you up front that everything, and I'm paraphrasing here mainly because of how it reads here, okay? But anything that you sell, it doesn't matter what it is a taxable event. So they're pretty much telling you here ahead of time, because you're buying something, if you sell it, it potentially has a tax bill attached to it. Okay. Buyers shall receive a CLTA and LTA. We've talked about that. One is a seller's policy to the buyer, and the other one is a lender policy to the buyer. CLTA and ALTA. And every single time I got to sit here and battle myself as to which one's which. I'm pretty sure CLTA is the seller's policy to the buyer. The ALTA is for the lender. Am I right, Larry?
Yes, you are, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's okay. No, it's just because I always have to battle that. Okay, so Larry would know that. Okay, the title company can provide information about the availability, coverage, and cost of the other title policies, and endorsement. If the homeowner's policy is not available, buyer shall choose another policy. Instruct escrow in writing. Okay, shall pay at the increase in cost. So this is also covered on page 2. Which is it's page 3, section 7, talks about the cost of and who's to pay for the title policy. Normally the seller pays it, doesn't mean the seller has to pay it, but automatically the buyer has to pay for the lender policy, because that has nothing to do with the seller. The buyer is getting a loan, and literally that has nothing to do with the seller. So the seller actually can't pay the buyer's policy for the lender. So is it possible that a seller may know of something that can affect title that is not on record? And I can't think of any examples at the moment, but I would say yes. The seller can know about things that are not on record. And title companies aren't perfect, and the general index doesn't have all the information. But yeah, Larry, chime in, please.
Yeah, verbal agreements between neighbors.
So there's an example.
That wouldn't show up in title, but they're there and they forget to bring them forward. And yet, as it happens, that person moves out, they continue to do something and they want to come back and do stuff on it. There are things that show up that we suffered a loss on one that was 25 years old. It was a grading permit to raise the valley out in Diamond Bar area, and found it. They ignored it because it was 25 years old. Month after we closed that transaction, they started to do the grading. So you never know what's going to happen till those things start to happen.
Yeah. So actually, when you were talking about it, it reminded me that sometimes, like you said, a verbal agreement. It could be fences.
Yep.
It could be like common driveways. Those are things that affect title potentially, and that are not on record. A lot of times, those are just written agreements between the neighbors.
What about encroachments? Because people may know their property does exist because they had a survey done and it's not public record, and they don't disclose that also.
So yeah, so there's some examples of things that are affecting title that are not on record. So these are things now, as us as professionals, that if we know they exist, we can potentially address them, right? So please note that every transaction is considered a taxable event. So I mentioned that earlier, right? Always advise your clients to consult with an appropriate professional concerning tax or legal matters. Could someone tell me why? So I actually already said why. And it's because anything that's being sold is a taxable event. Okay. So any other questions or comments on section 13, C, D, and E? Can a buyer purchase a home without title insurance? And I did mention that earlier. They can if they're buying cash, because normally lenders do require title policies. But do I advise it or recommend it? Absolutely not. Every single transaction should have title insurance, without question. If a buyer is frugal enough to think that they don't need one, and frugal is not the word that I'm thinking, okay, I would not recommend it. So just know that I would always recommend getting title insurance on any transaction. And as always, the initials at the bottom of the page, that is page 5 of the RPA. So how many people or inspectors can a buyer take to a property to inspect? Anybody know the number? How many people can they take to a property? Anybody? Okay, well, so there's not an actual number, guys, and somebody's chiming in here. Lupe, what do you say?
No, I was gonna say the agent and the buyer, the two buyers, the husband and wife. That's what I've been getting.
Well, I think what you're referring to is recently the whole COVID thing that we had going on
Yes.
For some
yes.
time. I think that's what you're referring to, but the question is actually talking about how many inspectors can you take to the property?
Oh, how many inspectors? No, as many as you want to pay.
Thank you. Well said. That means that it's unlimited. You can take as many as you want, right? You could take 100 different people to that property to inspect it because you have inspection rights. Thank you, Lupe, for saying that. It is important to explain in writing to your client that brokers are not experts in any fields of expertise concerning the building, utility, or usage of the property. Is it important to say that in the contracts? Yeah, I see Lupe is saying, yeah, absolutely, yes. Is a buyer responsible for any damage they or their inspectors cause to a home? We talked about in the indemnity, right? Are the buyers responsible for any damage? Anybody?
Yes, Mr. Alex.
Okay, Lupe, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. That's the indemnity section that we talked about earlier. I don't remember the section number off the top of my head. I'm not that good, but we did just talk about it in our previous slide. Why is it important to refer to the conveyance of title as grant deed? What about you, Mr. Larry? You want to chime in on this one? Or Lupe, what do you say?
No, I was gonna say repeat it.
Why is it important to refer to the conveyance of title as a grant deed? Okay, so actually we have a question. So real quick, it's important that the conveyance of title be illustrated as a grant deed because that's the type of deed being transferred. So they are signing, the seller is signing the grant deed, and actually that's what it says in the contract, that's how the property is being conveyed. Because it's not a quitclaim deed, it's not a divorce deed, it's not a reconveyance, it's not any of these other types of deeds. So this is why it's important. But we have a question. If seller refuses to take second inspector, what do they do? Okay, Mr. Doshi, the seller can't refuse that. They can't refuse it. You know why? Because if you read the contract, it says that they can take as many as they want. I don't remember exactly the section, but if you want, we can at a later date, other than the presentation, give me a call and I'll find you the section, because it sounds like you're having problems with the seller. We'll find the section where it says that the seller, the buyer has inspection rights within their contingency period. So the seller can't refuse. They've already agreed. And let me tell you something else. Read section 1E of the contract. And it says that the brokers are not part of the agreement between the buyer and seller. So if you have a broker saying, oh no, you can't do that, you can't bring another inspector, you can tell that broker that he doesn't have the right to say that, because they're not part of the agreement between the buyer and seller. Remember, us as agents, all we're doing is facilitating. We don't have any say whatsoever. The only say that we have is to collect our check. Believe it or not, that's the only say that we have. So, Mr. Doshi, take my number down. If you want to talk about it, your particular transaction, feel free to call me. I'll be more than happy to show you where it says it in the contract. And I can give you some ideas on what you can do to try and find solutions to your problem. There's something called an ombudsman that the boards have that will help you settle these disputes. So you don't have to get attorneys involved and mediation and all that stuff. We call them ombudsman. And if you look on the CAR website, or sometimes they are on, if you go on your board's website, there's information there on how to contact those individuals, because that's what they're there for. They're there to defuse those kind of disputes. Whereas the buyer and seller are actually in an agreement and you have it in writing. Remember what I always say, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove, right? And we're not about trying to, knock somebody over the head with a bat, even though we'd like to do that, right? And I speak facetiously, but there are very diplomatic ways of dealing with individuals who refuse to follow their contracts. And I hate to say it, but it's one of those things where, you're saying, hey, you know what, I'm trying to take another inspector out there, and it's probably because you're not sure about something and your buyer wants to know, but he's not being allowed to find out. Guess what? If you guys end up closing that transaction and the buyer does find out, guess who's liable? The seller. Oh, wow, what do you know? And I'm not an attorney, but I can pretty much tell you that that's probably where the chips will fall, right? The seller will be liable, and now the buyer's probably going to end up suing the seller just because they were so clever and say, oh no, we're going to try and hide something from this guy, right? So not a good idea by any means. So anyway, any questions or comments on those? So let's move on to section 14. We're on slide 14. It's 6:58, so we're actually doing pretty good on time. Moving on to time periods, right? So this is time period removal of contingencies and cancellation rights. The following time periods may only be extended, altered, modified, or changed by mutual written agreement. It is the contingency removal and the cancellation form that are referenced there as CR and CC. Seller has 7 days after acceptance to deliver buyer all reports, disclosures, and information which the seller is responsible under paragraphs 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, and 13. Right, by the time specified, right? Seller has not delivered any such item. Buyer, after first delivering to seller notice to perform, may cancel this agreement. So sometimes, and I'll give you guys a little nugget on this. Although, let me read this paragraph first, because this might what it might be talking about. The word may becomes the most important word in this paragraph. The fact that some sellers may want to cancel and can't provides a loophole in the contract. Yeah, that's exactly what it's talking about. I was just going to say that. What can a buyer do in the event the seller does not perform, the buyer wants to move forward? Okay, so what I was going to say is that there are times when you get under contract and you're in this period of the first 7 days of the transaction, okay? And the seller all of a sudden gets another offer for $20,000 more. And let's just sweeten it up a bit. It's a cash deal, so you know it's going to close, okay? But when the seller, and here's a question for you guys: when you guys are under contract, can the seller just cancel? Can anybody answer that question for me?
No.
They cannot. The only way the seller can cancel is if the buyer doesn't perform. So once the seller's under contract, they're done. But here's a little loophole. They go around and they say, oh, you know what? We're just not going to give them the disclosures. And if you read this here, the buyer now has the right to cancel, because this becomes another contingency, right? the buyer can cancel. But what if the buyer doesn't want to cancel? Well, it kind of goes back to Mr. Doshi's situation where he probably doesn't want to cancel. He wants this thing to go through. Hey, call an ombudsman and let the board figure it out, because now what's happening is the seller is not contractually complying, and either is the agent. So I would say don't cancel the transaction, get the boards involved, right? Get regulatory agencies involved, because that pretty much locks them into the transaction. So understand that there's that little loophole, that don't fall into that trap, because that's what it becomes, a trap. So now we're talking about section 14B. Okay, so buyer has 17 days after acceptance, unless otherwise agreed in writing, to complete all investigations, review all disclosures, reports, and lease documents are assured by buyer pursuant to paragraph 8B and other applicable information which buyer receives from seller, and approve all matters affecting the property, and deliver to the seller signed copies of statutory and lead disclosures. Now, the reason why I highlighted this is because I actually got in an argument with an agent one time where they sent me over their disclosures, and it was probably like 2 days into the transaction, and we had a 17-day contingency, and she asked me like 2 days later, hey, when are we getting those disclosures back? And I said, well, typically we don't send disclosures back until we're ready to remove contingencies. And she goes, oh my God, I've never heard that before. And I said, well, it says it right in the contract. If you like, I can read it to you. Buyer has 17 days after acceptance to deliver to seller signed copies of statutory and lead disclosures and other disclosures delivered by the seller. I'll read it again. Buyer has 17 days after acceptance, and I highlighted it, deliver to seller signed copies. And you guys might fall into this situation. Now, does it mean that I can't give them to her 4 days after, you know, we receive them? No, I can give them to her. But here's the thing. What are the disclosures? The disclosures are for the buyer to review. I don't necessarily want to give them back right away to the seller, right? Because there might be more. I want to make it complete. So this is what I do. I'm not ready to start this discussion with the listing agent if I'm working with the buyer until my buyer has been fully disclosed. So now this is where it gets a little funky, okay? And we're going to move into 14B3 in just a second, okay? But let's do 14B2 real quick. Within the time specified, buyer may request the seller make repairs. So that goes into the section where now the buyer can ask for repairs, but understand that seller has no obligation to agree or to respond. So most agents that I know don't even know that that exists. So I kind of play on that a little bit, okay? Because we do a request for repairs and they automatically think that they have to respond, and they don't, okay? But it's more of a courtesy. It's like, hey, you know what? Something was revealed that we didn't see in the listing. We didn't see during our preview of the property. We didn't know until after we got the inspection and the disclosures. So you know what? And maybe even the appraisal. Maybe the appraisal came in $10,000 low. Okay. So hey, we're respectfully asking you to renegotiate with us because of these things that were revealed. Okay. These were not things that we knew ahead of time. So this is where it kind of keeps that open door, right? That now the buyer has the opportunity to request repairs from the seller. It's an open door. It's an open door for renegotiation. And they have three options. The buyer has three options. They can move on with the transaction, they can try and renegotiate, or they can cancel. Those are the three options. The seller has options. They can respond by accepting the request from the buyer. They can renegotiate the request, or they can simply ignore it. Those are their three options. But this is what we call aggressive negotiations. They have these abilities to where it's not causing a huge argument or fight between the buyer and seller because they have their open door. Nobody's forcing them to do anything. And that's true for both buyer and seller. And that's why this is important. So let's move on to B3. Okay, so the buyer has three options. Oh, look at that. I just talked about that, so I apologize. The buyer has three options just before they remove contingencies. What are they? So I just mentioned that. Can somebody repeat what those three options are? Anybody? The buyer and seller have three options. What are the buyer's three options when they're ready to remove contingencies? Okay, the three options are they can renegotiate, they can move on with the transaction, or they can cancel. Those are the three options.
Okay, say it, Johnny.
I'm sorry?
He's asking you.
Renegotiate, or you can just avoid the contract, or
Or cancel, right? You can cancel.
you can renegotiate or cancel the contract.
Or you can just move forward,
Move forward, yes.
right? So those are the three options, right?
Yes.
Well, it's kind of the same for the seller. They can renegotiate,
Yes,
they can accept the request from the buyer, or they can just ignore it,
yeah, they don't have to respond.
right? So that's what we're saying here, that there's open doors here for both parties. So we're not getting into, like, grabbing them by the neck and saying, you have to do this. No, nobody's forcing anybody to do anything, right? This is all contractual, and it's what we call aggressive negotiations. Okay. So anyway, any other questions or comments on that? So now let's move on to B3, because this is my favorite. Oh, okay. Well, there's the three options, right? Proceed, cancel, or request. Okay. So seller can respond, renegotiate, or decline to comment. So there are the three options. I forgot I put that down there. So this is my favorite, 14B3. By the end of the time specified, buyer shall deliver to seller removal of the applicable contingencies with the contingency removal, or cancel the agreement. However, if any report, disclosure, or information for which the seller is responsible is not delivered within the time specified, buyer has 5 days after delivery of such items of specified, which is later, to deliver to seller a removal of the contingency or the cancellation, which means that if the buyer has not been fully disclosed, and I know that, you'll see the listing agents, okay, you know what, today's October 20th, so you guys have to remove contingencies. And I'll say, excuse me, Mr. Listing Agent, but you haven't delivered the NHD. You haven't delivered some of the disclosures that you're supposed to deliver. So guess what? Don't force me to remove contingencies, please. And they say, no, I want those contingencies removed. Today's your last day. I said, well, Mr. Listing Agent, I try to be nice with you, but please read Section 14B3 of the contract, which clearly states that until I get those disclosures from you, I have 5 additional days to remove contingencies. When I finally get them, not from today. It's, you might deliver that to me in 3 or 4 days. That 5 days doesn't start clicking until then. 14B3, guys, remember that paragraph. Now, we're gonna have to remember another paragraph when the new RPA comes out, but for now, 14B3 is the ticket. Because let me tell you, the required disclosures, there are many of them, they're statutory. TDS, SPQ, the AS, FLD, properties built prior to 1978, the NHD, the AVID is a required by the state. That's also in Section 10, right? Those are the statutory disclosures. Everything else is questionable. You would have to maybe reconsider, but at the end of the day, you can invoke 14B3 if your buyer has not been fully disclosed. You got to think of it like this, okay? How can you remove contingencies until you have been fully disclosed? The answer is you can't. How can you remove contingencies if you don't know what the appraised value is, or you don't know certain things that you're supposed to know? You can't. That's why this is here. 14B3, guys, remember that. Moving on to 14B4, continuation of contingency, even after the end of time specified and before seller cancels, if at all, buyer retains the right in writing to either remove remaining contingencies, cancel this agreement based on remaining contingencies. Once buyer's written removal of all contingencies delivered to seller, seller may not cancel this agreement pursuant to 14D1. So let's let's understand what that says. So before we said that the only way the buyer can, or I'm sorry, the only way the seller can cancel is if the buyer doesn't perform, right? But once the buyer has removed contingencies, now the seller has no way to cancel, because guess what? They removed contingencies, now they're both locked in. Now, the consequence to the buyer is that they could potentially lose their deposit, okay? And I say potentially because there's a few loopholes there. But now the seller's pretty much locked in completely. So could the seller cancel before? No, but once they remove contingencies, much less than can they cancel. Okay. Access to the property, buyers shall have access to the property to conduct inspections within 17 days after acceptance, whether or not any part of the buyer's investigation has been waived or removed. So even if they remove contingency, let's say on day 10, they still have the opportunity to investigate. Oh, Mr. Well, I'm assuming that it's Mr. and Mrs. Doshi that are listening. There's your section right there, 14B5. Buyer shall have access to the property to conduct inspection and investigations after acceptance, whether or not part of the buyer's investigation contingency has been waived or removed. That could be one of the answers that you were looking for. Concerning section B3, I would suggest to the clients that you place a statement on all contracts or counteroffers. Buyer and seller both agree and acknowledge all parties agree to review and endorse all broker required disclosures and return within time specified within 14B1. Can someone suggest why? So I'm talking about putting this comment in there. So it's after the colon there. Buyer and seller both agree and acknowledge all parties agree to review and endorse all broker required disclosures and return within time specified 14B1. The reason why I put that on my counter offers is because I always get this. I get in a transaction and Lupe, take a picture of that, will you? I can tell you about it later, but the reason why is this. I like to put that on my counter offers or something to that effect, okay? Because I'm constantly sending out disclosures, and then I get back, oh no, we don't sign those, or oh no, we don't need that, or oh no, and I'm like, excuse me, we're a brokerage too, and because I am a professional, I like to get my stuff complete and straight. And I like to relay that to all my clients. Okay. So please don't argue with me about what you would like in your file. If you don't want it in your file, that's fine. You can throw it away if you want to, but I require that in my file. So guess what? I'm getting the buyer and seller to agree to it. So Mr. Agent, they've already agreed to it. You can't say anything about it. Remember 1E of the contract. The agents are not part of the agreement between the buyer and seller. So if they both agree to endorse all of the broker required disclosures, and I'm telling you, my broker requires this disclosure, okay, then guess what? The seller already agreed to sign it. Now, if it's something that it says on there, like something crazy on the disclosure, then of course they don't have to sign it. No judge in the land will ever tell them they have to. But all of the disclosures that we're talking about are reasonable disclosures, and the majority of them are CAR forms. So they're not unreasonable disclosures. So this is why I would simply suggest, and some of you might think I'm a nut, okay, I get it, but at the end of the day, this is what I do. You guys are welcome to use some of the same terminologies. There's that box that I was talking about earlier where you can remove all the contingencies with the offer, okay? I don't suggest using this box, but it's there in the event that, yeah, exactly. I don't suggest using the box at all, but it's there because sometimes there are just some clients that don't care to have a loan appraisal or investigation contingency doesn't mean that they can't investigate, because they can. It just means that they can't cancel anymore. So understand that pretty much what they're doing is they're removing the contingencies when they submit the offer. And again, it doesn't mean that the seller doesn't have to disclose, because they still have to disclose, and the buyer can still investigate. And let's see if I highlighted anything on it. If buyer removes any contingency without adequate understanding of the property's condition of buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of the broker. Buyer removes a contingency specified in the attached contingency removal form. And so what does this imply about the disclosures, reports, and advisories? And I'll say it again. In other paragraphs, the seller still has to give disclosures, reports, and advisories. It doesn't remove that requirement from the seller. The seller still has to give that information to the buyer. Doesn't matter if they remove contingencies or not. Any questions or comments on that slide? So section 14D, seller's right to cancel. Seller right to cancel buyer's contingencies if by the time specified in this agreement, buyer does not deliver to seller a removal of applicable contingencies or cancellation of this agreement, then seller, after first delivering the notice to perform, can cancel this agreement. In such event, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit. What? They should authorize the return of the buyer's deposit? Yes, because they haven't removed contingencies. That's the stipulation. Except for fees incurred by buyer. Now, escrow may have some fees. Not too many escrows actually charge them. But if you read the escrow instructions, the majority of escrow instructions do talk about a cancellation fee. And a lot of times it's like $500. So you need to let your buyers know about that stuff. But I think the important thing here is this is buyer shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit. You know, I don't know how many times I've had to show that to an agent because they insist like, oh no, we're keeping their deposit. It's like, excuse me, the buyer and seller have already agreed. Seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit if they haven't removed contingencies. They've already agreed, Mr. Agent. The buyer would have been fully notified and had the allowed time to have made a decision. What games do most sellers agents play at this point? And we just talked about that. They try to keep that deposit regardless. So seller's right to cancel. In terms of the buyer's contract, seller, after first delivering to buyer a notice buyer to perform, may cancel this agreement if, by the time specified, buyer does not take this action. Deposit funds as required. So that has to do with the earnest money deposit, right? If the buyer doesn't deposit the earnest money deposit, the seller can cancel, right? Deliver a notice of FHA or VA costs. That's actually on page 1 at the very bottom, section 3. Deliver a letter as required by paragraph 3J1, which is the loan approval letter. Deliver in writing, assume or accept leases or liens specified in 8B, which is could be like solar panels and water softeners, could be a security system leases, right? Return statutory and lead-based paint disclosures back to the seller. Sign or initial separate liquidation damages forms, right? Provide evidence of authority to sign in representative capacity as specified in paragraph 19. So see, this could be a trick again. This could be a trick where the seller is trying to cancel, right? And the buyer hasn't returned some of these disclosures. So these are all things that are loopholes for the buyer to cancel. So understand that the buyer has all of these obligations. You have to return this stuff. but even then, the seller authorizes the return of the buyer's deposit. Okay, there are many reasons why a seller can cancel, but can they do it without a notice to perform? Can a seller well, let's start with that. Can a seller just cancel without a notice to perform? Let's say the buyer didn't do one of these things. Anybody? Can a seller cancel without a notice to perform? No, they need to give a notice to perform, right? Can a seller put the property back on the market if the buyer is not responding to these requests?
No,
Yeah, no, not by MLS rules, but have I seen agents do that? Yeah, they've done it and they're in violation. But to be quite frank, nobody's really policing the industry. You would have to say something about it. But no, they wouldn't be able to put it back on the market. And they literally, most of them do, right? But it is an MLS rule. They can't until they actually have a cancellation. Any questions or comments on that section? So we have the notice of buyer seller to perform has to be in writing, right? Be signed by the applicable buyer or seller. Give the other party at least so many days, and it gives you an option to change it. So understand that they can't change it to one. It's two or more. Okay, guys. So let me read this whole sentence. A notice of buyer to perform or notice of seller to perform may not be delivered any earlier than 2 days prior to the expiration of the applicable time the other party to remove the contingency or cancel this agreement or meet an obligation specified in paragraph 14. So what that's saying is that let's say that the contingency is up on the 20th, right? They can't give that contingency until the 18th. They give it on the 17th, it's void. But if it's up on the 20th, they can give it on the 18th, which means the seller intends on canceling as soon as the contingency date is up, which would be the end of business day on the 20th. And I'm just using a hypothetical. So effective buyer's removal of contingencies. If buyer removes in writing a contingency or cancellation rights, unless otherwise specified in writing, buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have complete all buyer's investigations and review of reports and other applicable information and disclosures pertaining to their contingency or cancellation rights. So it's already presuming here, we talked about this earlier, how can you remove contingencies if you haven't been fully disclosed? So here it's saying, right, that it's presuming that you've conclusively deemed that you have all that information. So it's actually saying pretty much the reverse, but it's saying that, hey, you have all the information and this is why you remove the contingencies. You remove the contingencies because you elected to proceed. Assume all liability, responsibility, and expense for repairs or corrections pertaining to those contingencies or cancellation right for the inability to obtain financing or the inability to obtain financing. So once you remove contingencies, right, the idea is that you understand that you can and will close the loan, that you're okay with the value, and you're okay with the condition of the property and anything affecting its desirability. That's why you're removing contingencies. And so it has to be clear now, because again, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. It has to be clear to the buyer and seller what the removal of the contingencies mean. And that's what this section 14F is talking about. So most of the time, contract timeframes are guesstimates. You either need to extend them or cancel. But when the buyer has been notified, it gives them a chance to save their deposit in writing. That is, if they don't wish to cancel. So the idea is that if you're running out of time, and this is why I call them guesstimates, ask for an extension. You know, there's no reason why you can't talk to the other side and let them know, hey, you know what, we need more time for this reason, right? Because remember, the seller can't cancel. They can threaten, but they can't cancel. And this, of course, you need so much time that they give you a notice to perform and then they potentially cancel. So you just have to watch out for that. But there's no reason why you can't have that type of relationship with the other side. So close of escrow before buyer or seller may cancel this agreement for failure of the other party to close escrow, right? So now this is after now the buyer has removed contingencies. You can't give them a notice to perform anymore because a notice to perform has to do with the contingencies, right? So now you're in a position where both parties are obligated, right? So if for some reason the buyer hasn't closed escrow yet, you give them a demand to close escrow. So understand there's a difference. If you have already removed contingencies, you're not giving them a notice to perform anymore because that notice is for removal of contingencies. Now that the contingencies are removed, you have to give them a demand to close escrow, which is the DCE form. And it's served the same way as a notice to perform. It gives you 3 days or more to deliver. A DEC may not be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow. So they're pretty much telling you that if you're supposed to close on the 20th, you can only give it on the 17th. Okay. Section G, although rare, does happen in the event that contingencies are removed and escrow is set to close, but doesn't for same delay. It allows the buyer a little more time to close in writing as a last-ditch effort to not lose the deposit. Any questions or comments on those sections? So let's move on to 14H. We're coming up on slide 18 and we're at 7:27, so we're actually doing pretty good on time. Effective cancellation of deposits. If buyer or seller gives written notice of cancellation pursuant to rights duly exercised under these terms, the parties agree to sign mutual instructions to cancel the sale and escrow and release the deposit, if any, to the party entitled to the fund. So they pretty much have already agreed that they're going to sign it. So how many times have we seen, oh no, the seller's not going to sign the cancellation or the buyer's not going to sign it? You know what I mean? It's like they've already agreed. If we get to this point, they've already agreed. So release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions for the parties. And this is because we have an unbiased third party, which is escrow, that can't release the funds until you have mutual agreement. Escrow only acts on written agreement. So this is why they need a mutually signed cancellation. If either party fails to execute mutual instructions to cancel escrow, one party may make a written demand to escrow holder for the deposit. So here you have the forms BDRD and SDRD, right? Escrow holder upon receipt shall promptly deliver once a demand to the other party. If within 10 days after the escrow holder's notice, the other party does not object to the demand, escrow holder shall disperse the party making the demand. If the escrow holder complies with the preceding process, each party shall be deemed to have released escrow holder from any and all claims and liability related. So there's your hold harmless for the escrow company. Escrow holder at its discretion may nonetheless require mutual cancellation instructions. A party, so which pretty much says that they don't necessarily have to follow the BDRD or the SDRD. A party may be subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000 to refuse to sign cancellation instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to who's entitled to the deposit. So it should be clear who's entitled to the deposit, and whoever's not signing can now be subject to a $1,000 fine on top of losing whatever else is there. Okay. So when a transaction appears to be canceled for reasons unknown, both parties at separate times have been known to ignore the situation. Section H covers the ability to release tied up monies from escrow holder, and of course requires further notice. And then of course, we're initialing at the bottom of page 6, right? So I do believe that that's the last slide other than final thoughts. So any questions or comments on that last section? So most of us grow up having assumptions about purchase certain items, whether it's cars, furniture, even food. We think the sellers of such items have some kind of honor or self-respect about their behavior. Well, they don't. we must put laws, rules, and regulations in place in order to allow both parties to be well informed about the law, the risk, and their purchase or sale. It allows a buyer to properly be informed about a purchase and make the decision as to whether or not it is worth what was afforded. The buyer is put in check, buyer beware, that sellers may not allow all defects and allow the buyers to compensate with a proper investigation. Once all is revealed, they have the option to move forward, negotiate, or cancel. A pretty fair deal. On the other side, sellers need to know that if you put their house on the market, there's no safe or contractual way to cancel. The contract is binding unless the buyer does not perform or cancels themselves. Sellers beware. We don't hear that too much, do we? So that said, guys, let's move on to affiliates and resources. There's my information. You guys are welcome to take it down. And my email address, if you care to write me. If you guys aren't on the text reminder, you shoot me an email with your name and phone number, and I'll put you on the text reminder. Most of you are probably getting my my emails on Mondays or Tuesdays, and I also send one out for Zoom as well. There's Mr. Larry's information. Larry is usually on the meetings here with us, and you guys are welcome to give him a call. I also put out some of his handouts with Old Republic. There's his email address, phone number. If you guys should have any title questions or need resources in terms of help getting business, Larry can help you guys with that. There's Miss Liz. If you guys need loan approvals and or loans, she does FHA, VA, or conventional loans here in the office at ERS Mortgage and also with Uptown Realtors. There's Mr. Dave. Talked about him. I do endorse his product. He is a real estate coach, motivational speaker. He does things a little bit different than I do. I do technical training that we've been doing, these past weeks. But Dave does motivational stuff. He tells you how to get business. So it's a little different. Now, I do believe that coupled with Dave's training, anybody following my direction and also his direction will be well-rounded. So I do recommend his product. And then there's Miss Shamim. She does property ID, NHD reports. There's her phone number and information if you have any questions or need to know how to order any of those. So any questions or comments, guys? We're at the end of our presentation. We're at 7:33, did a pretty good time today. My throat's getting a little raspy, a lot of talking. Thank you for joining me in part 4 of 6 of the residential purchase agreement. Next week, we'll be doing part 5. Again, I'm not an attorney and or an accountant, but I do give my never to be humble opinion on these matters. I read the contract just like you guys do, and I interpret it probably very similarly. I do have 32 years of wisdom and background in the real estate business, so this is why I care to share. I do want the real estate industry to be stronger, and so this is why I push that direction. So you guys are always welcome to invite anyone that you think might benefit from these meetings, licensed or unlicensed, and or any age, because there might be some people that are interested in making this a career choice, so they want to see what it's about. This is one of those pieces of the puzzle, if you will. So that said, guys, thank you, Robert and Sully. You guys are always those amazing students, if you will, always they're ready, willing, and able to learn, right? So hopefully the new RPA will be as interesting, and we'll be able to interpret it freely. I'm hoping that it reads good. Mr. Doshi, I noticed that you have your mic on. Did you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes, anytime. Like I said, you guys are welcome anytime. I am recording these sessions, so I will be putting the link out soon because I do believe that I was waiting to get at least 20 of the recordings up, and I believe this is number 20, if I remember correctly. I'm hoping to have a full year's curriculum, which is 52 presentations performed. So in the coming months, you guys will help me do that. So you guys keep logging on. I appreciate it. I do enjoy having the questions and the comments. I certainly don't like to do a dialogue, so you guys know that. I'm sorry, I don't like to do a monologue. I would rather have a dialogue and talk with you guys about any potential situations that you might have and or things that you are looking for solutions. Okay, so thank you guys again for logging on. If there's anything else, I'm ready to sign off. You guys have any comments? You know the Dodgers are playing right now, right? I think that's why we had a small class today. Last week we had almost, I think, 17 or 18 people on last week, because some of you were begging me to do the RPA. So oddly enough, there's only 5 or 6 people, but I did have some people text me and tell me that they weren't going to be on the meeting because of the Dodgers. But because it's recorded, like I said, I still wanted to do it. I'll know, I'll see the highlights of the Dodger game later on, but for the most part, to me, this is more important. So again, thank you guys for coming on. If there's nothing else, I will be logging off. All right. Okay, Miss Lupe, good to see you again.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you again. So I'll see you guys next week. Okay, we'll be doing number 5.